Good evening, everybody. Tonight, we'll have a great time learning. I want to welcome all of you to our class. Tonight's class is dedicated by our dear friends, Ida and David Schattenstein, in the loving and inspirational memory of my dear friend, our dear friend, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, Ben Zalman Yude Deitch, and in the loving memory of a young soul, Alter Shula, Bas, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, and Hindel Swerdlov. It is also dedicated by the Schattensteins in the merit of their new daughter, Alta Yette Shula, or Aliyah Schattenstein Mazel Tov. You know, they tell the anecdote about the woman who wakes up in the morning with a lot of excitement. And she tells her husband, I had an amazing dream, and I'm looking to understand the meaning of the dream. What do you think it means? What was the dream? He asks her. The dream was that I received as a gift an extraordinarily exquisite diamond necklace. What do you think this dream means? And the husband tells her, by the time evening arrives, you will understand the meaning of the dream. The woman is overwhelmed from emotion. All day she can't think about anything but anticipate that great moment. Indeed, evening arrives, and she hears the key in the door. With bated breath and eager anticipation, she waits for her husband's entrance into the house. Indeed, he's holding a package. He gives her the package. With tremendous excitement, she tears open the package and she sees a book. And the book is entitled, The Meaning of Dreams. Dreams, dreams, dreams occupy a major portion of the book of Genesis. It seems like the stories, the narratives flow through dreams. It begins with Jacob leaving the Holy Land, traveling to Mesopotamia to his uncle Laban, and on the way, he goes to sleep, and he has an elaborate dream, the dream of the ladder with the angels and so forth. There is the dream later of Jacob at the end of the portion of Vayetze concerning the flock. And then there are, of course, the dreams of Joseph, dreaming about the sheaves and the sun and the moon bowing down to him. There are the dreams of Pharaoh's butler and baker. And finally, in the portion of Miketz, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, has two dreams. In his dream, Pharaoh, the monarch of the superpower of the time, Egypt, dreams that he is standing at the Nile River. And from the river emerge 7 good-looking, fat, healthy, robust cows. And they eat from the grass, the reeds at the river. Following these 7 cows emerge another 7 cows, lean, hungry, skinny, horrible-looking. And they stand near the first set of cows at the bank of the Nile River. And then Pharaoh's dream continues. The 7 lean cows eat up and swallow the 7 fat cows. He wakes up only to fall asleep again and have a second dream of 7 ears of grain which grow. Again, they're healthy looking, they're robust, they're fat. Followed by 7 ears of grain which are ugly and lean and very skinny and devoid of any substance. And here too, what happens? The 7 ears of grain, of lean grain, swallow up the 7 ears of fat and full and healthy looking grain, and Pharaoh wakes up. He summons all of his experts to try to decipher the dreams. But as the Torah says, Ein poiser oisam leparoi. No one can give an adequate and decent, pleasing interpretation of these dreams to Pharaoh until the butler reminds himself about a Hebrew slave, Joseph. and shares with Pharaoh about Joseph's ability to explain the symbolisms behind dreams. Pharaoh summons Joseph immediately from the dungeon where he has been incarcerated for more than a decade. His clothes are changed, he gets a haircut, and he's summoned and brought before Pharaoh. Pharaoh presents to Joseph his two dreams, and Joseph presents the meaning behind the dreams. Joseph says that the 7 fat cows represent 7 years of plenty, 7 years of abundance of food that will be in Egypt. The 7 ears of fat grain represent again 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine, of hunger, of emaciation, and hence the 7 lean cows, the 7 lean ears of grain. The 7 years of famine follow the 7 years of plenty. And the 7 years of famine will eat up, they will swallow up the 7 years of plenty. To the extent, as the dream said, when you look at the 7 lean cows, you will not see that they swallowed up 7 fat cows. When the years of hunger come, you will not know of the 7 years of plenty. The hunger will be so powerful and devastating, they will erase every last trace of the years of prosperity. They will be gone, obsolete, forgotten. Joseph now continues giving Pharaoh advice, and he says, and now Pharaoh must appoint a particular individual who will develop an entire rationing system where during the 7 years of plenty, food and grain will be put away continuously, so that when the 7 years of famine arrive, the country will not be devastated from hunger. The people and the cattle will be able to survive from the food that has been produced abundantly and has been saved in abundance during the preceding 7 years of plenty. Pharaoh is astonished. He's overwhelmed from Joseph's wisdom. In his words, he says, where can you find a man with such divine spirit? Pharaoh tells him, there is nobody as intelligent, brilliant, and wise as you. You will be the man. And he appoints him to become second in command, to actually become the prime minister of Egypt. You are under me. No one will be above you in this country. You are the second in command, and Joseph indeed becomes the viceroy of Egypt. The rest, as we say, is history. The commentators, the biblical commentators, almost all of them, address numerous questions concerning this narrative. And it is really fascinating to study this story with all of the commentators, because there are so many different questions and explanations and interpretations and insights. But I want to address tonight with you, my dear friends, a few of the major questions that perplex so many of the commentators. The first, when Joseph finishes explaining the symbolism behind the dream, namely, 7 years of plenty will be followed by 7 years of famine, Joseph immediately continues to give the king advice. He says, and you could look in source number 1, please open up below the video. There is a PDF document. It says on it curriculum. Please open up your curriculum so you can follow the sources inside if you wish. Joseph tells Pharaoh right after giving the interpretation, Pharaoh must appoint a wise and clever man and place him above the whole Egypt. And Joseph gives him detailed, elaborate advice what this man has to do. Under Pharaoh, this man has to create a whole administration and designate an entire staff to allocate, to ration the food in every single city and put it away and preserve it and figure out a way of rationing it, allocating it, preserving it as a deposit for the years of hunger. Question is, where does a prisoner, a slave, coming out of a dungeon, get the audacity, the chutzpah, to give the king advice? The king summoned Joseph not to advise him how to run his country and how to deal with problems. The king summoned him for one thing and one thing only, to explain to him the meaning of the dreams. In ancient countries, in the ancient history, this can be compared to treason. You can die just for this. A person giving unsolicited advice to the king, telling him what to do. Never mind the fact that Joseph was a slave, a prisoner, a criminal, quote unquote, although we know that he was innocent, who was summoned now specially to interpret the dreams. From Joseph's perspective, right after he finishes giving the interpretation, he may be returned right back to his dungeon in Egypt. He was just taken out for a few hours to speak to the king. And yet, when he finishes the interpretation, he stands up to Pharaoh and says, "My dear king, this is exactly what you have to do right now." Where did Joseph get the audacity to do this? Why did he do it? Why would he do this? Question number 2. It's obvious that Pharaoh was extremely impressed from Joseph's advice. Right after he finishes giving the king advice what to do, the Torah says, take a look at your sources, Vayitav hadover be'enei Pharaoh ve'enei kol avodav. This thing, this word that he said, the advice he gave, was extremely pleasing to Pharaoh and all of his servants, and Pharaoh says, you cannot find a man who has such divine spirit. But I want to ask you a question. How brilliant is it to come up with the idea that if 7 years of hunger will follow 7 years of plenty, during the years of plenty you should put away food for the years of hunger? Do you really have to have a PhD in economics and be a brilliant economist to come up with this idea? Ask any person, the most simple, illiterate, uneducated human being, and say, next week there's going to be a major snowstorm, and we're going to be locked up in our homes for a week. What should I do about food? And the person will not have to think much to tell you, I have a brilliant idea for you. You should go and purchase food this week and store it in your cabinet so that next week you'll have what to eat. Hooray, genius! People do it constantly when they hear there's going to be a storm. Sometimes they exaggerate a little bit. They go and empty out the stores for a week, for a month. Grosse Gedule, this is as simple as how everybody lives. Or many people live. Or what was so oppressive to Pharaoh? Joseph says, you're having a hunger, make sure you prepare food. You got to appoint somebody for that. Of course, you have to appoint somebody to be in charge. Somebody has to take care of it. Somebody has to make a system. You're dealing with a whole country. Joseph, anyway, did not discuss the mechanisms of doing it. He was just discussing the idea. The mechanism is always brilliant, to figure out a major system of administration. It should be professional. It should be effective. The food should be preserved. But the general advice that you have to do this, simple. But Pharaoh was impressed. Not only that, when the Torah says that Pharaoh was pleased with what Joseph said, it doesn't say Pharaoh was pleased with his dream interpretation. It doesn't say Vayitav hapisroin be'enei Pari. Look again in your curriculum. It doesn't say Vayitav hapisroin be'enei Pari. The dream interpretation was pleasing to Pharaoh. It says Vayitav hadover. The thing. Which thing? The last thing Joseph said. His last piece of advice. This is what was pleasing to Pharaoh. Although the main objective of summoning Joseph was to explain the dream, that is not even mentioned that Pharaoh was happy with the interpretation. I mean, it's obvious, but it's not even mentioned. What blew Pharaoh away? What staggered his imagination? What captured him in Joseph's message? His advice to put away food. Simple advice anybody would give. Third question. It's obvious that Pharaoh loved Joseph's interpretation. As I said, he loved his advice. That's what the Torah says explicitly. Obviously, he loved his dream interpretation and was extremely impressed by it. And when he tells his servants, there's no man who has such divine spirit And when he tells Joseph, I've never found somebody, there's nobody as wise and intelligent, he's referring to his advice. He's referring to also his interpretation of the dream. In fact, none of Pharaoh's dream experts can come up with this interpretation. But let's understand, what was so novel and unique about Joseph's interpretation? Isn't this actually the simplest and most direct explanation of the dream? Let me ask you a question. 7 fat, robust, good-looking, healthy-looking cows. What does that mean? Lots of food. 7 lean, skinny, ugly, emaciated cows. What is that a cause of? What does that mean? No food. 7 ears of grain, which are healthy, which are filled, which have substance, which are robust. What does that mean? There's good harvest, there's good plenty, there's good produce. 7 emaciated, horrible, ugly ears of grain, knocked out by the wind, the kernels are gone, there's nothing to them, means no produce. So 7 fat cows, a lot of food. 7 skinny cows, there's no food, very little food. 7 great ears, healthy ears of grain means there's good produce. 7 lean ears of grain, there's terrible produce. And that's what Joseph says. Joseph says you're going to have 7 seasons of produce, which is good. You'll have plenty. You'll have 7 seasons of produce, which will be horrible, and hence there'll be hunger and famine. And the 7 will eat up. The 7 skinny ones will eat up the 7 fat ones. The 7 years of famine follow the 7 years of plenty. It's a great interpretation. But is it really so brilliant that Pharaoh was like, wow? Isn't it pretty direct? And why did none of the Egyptian experts come up with this? If you have a dream about something that's very fat, robust, healthy versus something very emaciated, wouldn't even a child associate it with plenty versus hunger, famine? But none of the Egyptian experts, which Pharaoh summoned, because he woke up in the morning and he summoned all of his experts. Es kol chachamel, look in your sources, all of the sages, all of the wise men, all of the dream connoisseurs of Egypt were summoned. No one can come up with this. Why? What is even more perplexing, my dear friends, is they did come up with interpretations. It's not that they said we don't know what it means. They did give Pharaoh different insights into his dream. But the explanations they came up with are so far-fetched. And that's what seems so absurd. Why did they neglect and abandon the most direct, simple interpretation that it's referring to a prediction of famine and hunger, and gave other weird predictions completely alien to the substance and the chemistry of his dream? And let me discuss 2 of their interpretations. If you'll take a look at your sources in your curriculum, the Torah says that Pharaoh summoned all of the experts of Egypt, and he told them his dream, Ve'ein poiser oisam lepara. None of them can give an adequate interpretation to Pharaoh. Says Rashi. Rashi is the most basic biblical commentator, authored by the 11th century great French sage, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. What does Rashi say? Ve'ein poiser oisam lepara. Poisrim hayu oisam. They were explaining the dreams. Avaloi lepara. But their dreams were not reaching Pharaoh. They were not entering his ears. In other words, the Torah doesn't just say no one was interpreting them. The Torah says no one was interpreting them for Pharaoh. They were giving different interpretations. But for Pharaoh, these explanations were simply not working. He did not like what they said. What did they say? So Rashi says, Shahayu oimrim, they told him, Sheva bonos ata moilid, Sheva bonos ata koiver. You will give birth to 7 daughters. You will bury 7 daughters. The 7 healthy-looking cows represents the birth of 7 daughters. Why sons and not daughters? I will assume because the dream spoke about cows and not bulls. Okay. 7 lean cows would represent the death of 7 daughters. that would then swallow up the joy of the birth of 7 daughters, of the 7 daughters. So he gives birth to 7 children, the 7 children die, and that's the interpretation of the prediction that he was seeing in his dream. Pharaoh did not like what they said. This is the interpretation Rashi brings. And I ask you a simple question. Why did they give such a far-fetched interpretation? That it's symbolizing his children. When they can give a direct interpretation, that it's actually symbolizing the story itself. Plenty and famine. Good grain, bad grain. Healthy-looking cows, emaciated, hungry, lean cows who are starving because there's no food. We're going to explain all of this by prefacing one last question. And that is, Rashi's source for their interpretation comes from the Midrash. If you'll take a look in the Midrash, and I quote it in the sources, the Midrash in the portion of Miketz says that they gave a second interpretation to Pharaoh. And the reason the Midrash says they gave a second interpretation is because Pharaoh had 2 dreams. So they gave 2 interpretations for the 2 dreams. Their first is you're going to give birth to 7 daughters and you're going to bury the 7 daughters. The second is, V'chein amru, they also told him, Sheva shibolim atoivas, Sheva malchias atamechabesh, Sheva shibolim aroyas, Sheva africhias mardizbach. The 7 healthy ears of grain represents that you're going to conquer 7 empires. The 7 lean ears of grain represents that 7 empires will conquer you. You will have a time when you will expand your empire. You will conquer 7 other empires. But then you will be defeated by 7 empires. That was the interpretation. Here again, we wonder why they're going to this far-fetched why they're giving this far-fetched interpretation. But what is so interesting is Rashi would not quote the second interpretation of the Midrash. Even though Rashi knows that Pharaoh had 2 dreams, and Joseph himself was compelled to explain why Pharaoh had to have 2 dreams, although the interpretation of both, according to Joseph, was identical, to notify him from heaven that this is happening very soon, he should begin immediately. And yet, despite the fact Pharaoh has 2 dreams and the Midrash gives 2 different interpretations that his experts presented to him, Rashi deletes the second and only quotes the first about giving birth and burying the 7 daughters. Why? Tonight, I'm going to share with you one perspective, one explanation, one insight. It was presented by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, on Shabbat, the Shabbos of the portion of Miketz, Tovshin Lamed Daled, 1973, at his Shabbos afternoon gathering. Based on the perspective of how Rashi seems to be explaining the story. Now listen closely, please. Bear with us as we develop the Rebbe's explanation and answer to all of these questions and dilemmas. It's true that the experts of Egypt could have easily told Pharaoh the obvious. 7 years of plenty followed by 7 seasons of hunger. It is the simplest and directest and most obvious symbolism behind Pharaoh's dreams. But there was a reason that all of the Egyptian experts rejected this interpretation and instead went to search for far-fetched explanations for the dream. And the reason is because there was one detail in Pharaoh's dream that this message would not sit well with. There was one aspect in the narrative of Pharaoh's dream that could not be accounted for if they would present the interpretation that Joseph would ultimately interpret. Which detail was it? I'm going to ask you now to go to your sources because I want to look with you inside into this verse. Pharaoh sees that from the river, 7 fat and healthy-looking cows come out. Great. And what do? They eat, they pasture in the swamp, they eat from the grass and the reed. Good. What happens next? Vihine, take a look. Vihine. Sheva paris acheres, 7 other cows, oilos achereim in ayar, follow after them from the river. They come up after them from the river. Ra'ois mara, they look bad. Dakois basar, their flesh is lean. V'ta'amoidna eitzel haparos al svas haya'ir. And these 7 lean cows stand near the 7 fat cows at the bank of the river. And what happens next? V'taychalna haparos rois hamara v'dakas habasar esheva haparos yefais hamara v'abris. And the horrible-looking, lean-flesh cows eat up the 7 handsome-looking and healthy, robust cows. Vayikatz Pharaoh, and Pharaoh wakes up. Now, what is the problem here? Tell me, what is the problem here? I can understand 7 fat cows, 7 years of prosperity, of a great economy, great food, lots of produce, everybody's being nourished, everyone is walking around, healthy, looking robust, and maybe some of us fat. Fine. I can understand after that what happens. There is hunger, there is famine, there is emaciation, there's no food, there's no produce. Skinny, lean cows are walking around all over the place. Skinny, lean people, unfortunately. Bones. Why? No food. The 7 lean cows eat up the 7 fat cows. Why? The 7 years of famine completely consume and swallow up and devastate all the plenty. The recession is so bad that the years of prosperity are forgotten. Granted, beautiful. But one detail here doesn't work. Which detail doesn't work? Which detail in the dream does not work? There's something that we cannot account for according to this interpretation. You got it. V'ta'amoidna eitzel haparos al svas hayar. That the 7 lean, ugly-looking, emaciated cows stand near the robust fat cows at the edge of the river. In other words, there is a point in the dream when the 2 sets of cows coexist. When they're standing near each other, side by side. Here is the problem. How can you have famine and plenty simultaneously? I can first have seven fat cows, followed by 7 skinny cows, which swallow up the 7 fat cows. Makes sense? But how and where do I have, according to the interpretation of Joseph, 2 sets of cows representing opposite times simultaneously? If it's a time of plenty, it's not a time of famine. If it's a time of famine, it's not a time of plenty. Joseph would not say that part of Egypt was plentiful and part of Egypt was suffering from hunger. There were classes. There were the rich and there were the poor. There were people who had what to eat and people who didn't have what to eat. No. The interpretation here is going to be 7 years of plenty for the whole country and 7 years of famine for the whole country. 7 years of famine must follow 7 years of plenty. They cannot coexist with them. If it's a time of hunger, it's not a time of prosperity. If it's a time of prosperity, it's not a time of hunger. And this is why the experts of Egypt rejected the most straightforward interpretation. And they came up with a far-fetched interpretation. Which one? So Rashi tells us which one. And by telling us which one, he explains to us and shows to us what was perturbing them about the direct interpretation. What was their explanation for the dream? You're going to give birth to 7 daughters. You're going to bury 7 daughters. Now here is the meticulousness of his words. Now look at your sources for this Rashi. Rashi says, Sheva bonos ata moilid, Sheva bonos ata koiver. Grammatically, there is a redundancy here. What should have it said? Sheva bonos ata moilid. You will give birth to 7 daughters. Va'oisan ata koiver. And it is they you will bury. He doesn't say that. He says 7 daughters you will give birth to, and 7 daughters you will bury. Because what Rashi means is that what they told Pharaoh was it won't be the same daughters. In the olden days, especially a king, especially an Egyptian king, can have not one wife and not two wives, but dozens and dozens and dozens of wives and concubines, and hence different wives and concubines can give birth at the same time. When they said you're going to give birth to 7 daughters and you're going to bury 7 daughters, what they meant is it's not going to be the same daughters that are born or the same daughters that die. The interpretation of the dream interpreters of Pharaoh in Egypt was, you're going to give birth to 7 daughters from 7 wives. At the same time, another 7 daughters will die. What do they gain from this? Now they understand the coexistence of the 2 sets of cows. That's why they neglected the simple interpretation. And they went to search for a far-fetched interpretation about children being born and dying. Because what they was perturbing them was, how do we have the 2 sets of cows together? That didn't make sense. Either it's hunger or it's plenty. Either there's money or there's no money. Either there's food or there's no food. But you can't have, besides in quantum mechanics, you can't have simultaneously food and no food. Plenty and famine. Prosperity and hunger. You're fat and you're skinny. You have lots of food and you have no food. You're healthy and you're sick. You're handsome and you're ugly. Doesn't work. But according to their interpretation, you can have it in one time. How many children does Osama bin Laden have? They used to say 40. I hear now it's more than 40. Pharaohs didn't have a problem with this. Remember also that he's the king of Egypt. Generally, in ancient times with polygamy, this was not unnatural. Certainly a king, not of a very ethical democracy, but a king like Pharaoh of Egypt. Egypt was known as a morally depraved society, as Rashi puts it elsewhere, and you look in the sources, Shtufei Zimah. In Egypt, promiscuity was common, and adultery was common. And different relationships were very common for everybody, never mind for the king. And we all know the story of Abraham and Sarah. Why Sarah had to say that Abraham is my brother, not my husband? Because Pharaoh took her. This was a long time ago, but the concept was still there in Egypt. So at the same time, Pharaoh can have 7 daughters that are born and 7 daughters that die. And therefore, Rashi doesn't say Sheva bonos atamoiled v'oison atakover, the same ones that you give birth to, you'll bury. No, it's different daughters. And this explains wonderfully why Rashi deletes the second interpretation of the Medrash, that they told Pharaoh that you're going to conquer 7 countries. And you're going to be defeated by 7 countries. Because they weren't just looking for an interpretation. They were looking for interpretation to account for the coexistence of the 2 sets of cows. Logically to say that a king will go out to conquer 7 countries simultaneously, while 7 countries are attacking him, is unnatural. It's uncommon unless your name is Germany. But if your name is not Germany, to go and declare war against 7 different countries simultaneously, and at the same time have 7 different countries attacking you, you have to be meshuggah. You have to be insane to do this. So obviously, first you conquer one country, and then when you finish, you conquer another country. But when you're at war with 7 countries, you're trying to conquer 7 countries simultaneously. It's not normal. It's not logical. You conquer one, and then you do a second one, and then you do a third one. And to be involved in the conquest of 7 countries, while 7 countries are attacking you, you don't do that. You're spreading yourself too thin. So that's why Rashi doesn't even bring that interpretation. But according to Rashi, they would never present that. Because for that, they cannot explain why the 2 sets of cows are there simultaneously. They're trying to explain this detail. And this detail is unaccounted for in the story of war. It is only accounted for in the story of birth and death of the 7 daughters. This explains why they had to reject Joseph's interpretation even before they summoned Joseph. Now we'll be able to understand the uniqueness and the novelty of Joseph's interpretation. Joseph came to Pharaoh, and he didn't just tell him there are going to be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph accounted for this detail in the dream, that the 7 lean cows were standing side by side with the 7 fat cows. And this is the reason why Joseph continued to give Pharaoh advice what to do about the hunger. Namely, to create a system of rationing, of allocating and saving, storing the food for the time of hunger. It's not like everyone who reads the story understands it, that Joseph was giving Pharaoh advice. Yosef was not giving the king any advice. His advice was essentially a continuation of the interpretation of the dream. Joseph's advice to Pharaoh was part of explaining to him the dream itself. Part of deciphering and explaining to Pharaoh what the meaning of the dream was. When he told him you should appoint somebody to put away food during the years of plenty for the years of famine. Because this is how Joseph understood the meaning of the 2 sets of cows coexisting simultaneously. We asked a great question. It's not possible. 7 years of famine are follow the 7 years of plenty. 7 years of plenty precede the 7 years of famine. They can't coexist. Came Joseph and showed Pharaoh how the 2 sets of cows can coexist. How? If during the years of plenty you're preparing for the years of famine, then in your consciousness, in your mindset, you're acting as though the famine is here. If during the years of plenty, every single day, you're putting away food, why are you putting away food? You're not finishing all the food on your plate. You're not finishing all this food in your storehouse. Why? Because you know that soon will be 7 years of famine. So during the years of plenty, the consciousness of the famine is present in your life. You're thinking about it. You're cognizant of it, you're aware of it, and you're behaving in a certain way because of it. Which means, during the years of plenty, you already have, to a certain degree, the years of famine. Although they're not here practically and pragmatically, but in your mind they're here. You're preparing for it, you're cognizant of it, and every single day you're putting away part of the food that's on your table. Why are you putting away food? Why aren't you consuming it? Why are you saving up? Because in your consciousness and your mind, you're aware famine is coming, and it's creating a certain type of behavior. So the 7 lean cows are there simultaneously with the 7 fat cows. But because even during the fat and plenty years, there is a consciousness of the hunger that's there to the extent that you're acting in a certain way based on it. Conversely, if during the 7 years of plenty you put away food for the years of famine, so now when the years of famine come, you still have the 7 fat cows, because every single day you're nourishing yourself, you're nourishing your children, you're nourishing your cattle. How? You're gleaning from the years of plenty. So the 7 fat cows are still here, although they're not here because now there's hunger, and the hunger is devastating, and it consumed the years of plenty, and there's no trace of the plenty. But because you strategize, then you ration, then you put away food for the years of famine, so during the years of famine, you still have the years of plenty. You're still enjoying them, you're still celebrating them, you still have them because you're eating from them. So when Joseph was giving Pharaoh advice, he wasn't giving him unsolicited advice. You called Joseph to explain to you a dream, and suddenly Joseph tells the king what to do. Joseph would never have the idea or the chutzpah to tell the king what to do. Joseph was continuing to explain the meaning of the dream. The dream was not only telling Pharaoh there's going to be famine after plenty. Prepare for, there's going to be 7 years of prosperity followed by 7 years of hunger. That's not the dream. That's one part of the dream. The dream is telling you something else. Pharaoh, prepare during the years of plenty for the years of famine. Appoint somebody. Where does the dream say that? The 2 cows are the 2 sets of cows are there simultaneously. How can both years, how can the 14 years exist simultaneously? If during the years of plenty you prepare continuously for the years of famine, then both sets of years exist simultaneously. In the years of plenty, you have the consciousness of famine, and in the years of famine, you have the harvest of plenty. This then is what impressed Pharaoh so deeply? Number one, that Joseph can account for that inexplicable detail of the dream. Number two, and even more, what impressed Pharaoh so deeply is that Joseph showed him that the dream did not only contain the problem, the dream also contained the solution. It's easy to show the dreams that tell us of a pending crisis. It's easy to share the problem. What Joseph showed Pharaoh was that in his dream was contained also the solution to the problem. Joseph showed that the dream did not only tell him what God is going to do, the dream was also telling him what he is supposed to do, what Pharaoh is supposed to do, how he can be proactive and deal with the pending challenge, that when the challenge comes, he has all the abilities and resources to deal with it. And when Pharaoh sees that the interpretation of Joseph also contains the remedy, the solution, in addition for him accounting for that detail that drove Pharaoh insane, when Pharaoh sees that, he says, Ein noven v'chacham kamaycha. There is nobody as wise and as intelligent as you, and he appoints him to become the Prime Minister of Egypt. And here I should add one more detail. We can add many, many more details, but, and if you look at the sources, you'll see the source, the bibliography of the source of this class, if you want to go into it a little more. The first question I raised was how Joseph had the audacity, why would he think of giving the king advice that was unasked for? The Ramban asks this question, among others. Rabbeinu Moshe ben Nachman, the great 13th century Spanish sage, Talmudist, leader, physician, philosopher, polemicist, Ramban, Rabbeinu Nachmanides. He asked this question. He wrote a commentary on Chumash, and he asked this question. And what does he answer? He answers that Joseph's advice to Pharaoh was also part of the dream interpretation. Which part? When it says that the 7 fat cows ate up the 7 lean cows, Ramban says Joseph was explaining that to mean that during the 7 years of famine, they were eating from the 7 years of plenty. That's the meaning of the 7 skinny cows ate up the 7 fat cows, which means that they ate them. They ate them, that during the lean years, they were eating the fat years. They were eating from the fat cows. That's how the Ramban explains why Joseph gave Pharaoh advice, because the advice was part of the dream. However, according to Rashi, it is impossible to answer that. Why is it impossible to answer that? Because Rashi tells us, fascinatingly, that the symbolism behind the 7 fat cows eating the 7 skinny cows, and you can look in your sources to see what the Ramban says, but now I want you to look at the sources to see what Rashi says. Simin, shetehei kol simchas hasoiva nishkachas b'mei harav. The symbol of the eating up is that the whole joy of the prosperity will be forgotten during hunger. In other words, according to Rashi, the meaning of the fat cows eating the skinny cows is not like the Ramban says. That during the years of famine you will eat from the years of plenty. It means exact opposite. The famine will be so horrible. It will completely erase and delete every last trace and glimmer of joy during the good years, during the fat years. So Rashi can't say that this detail of the dream that accounted for Joseph giving Pharaoh advice. Because according to Rashi, when I say someone eats up something else, it can mean 2 things. According to Rashi, it means you ate it up, means you swallowed it up, you consumed it, it's obliterated. You ate it up, like you ate up your money, it's gone. According to the Ramban, what it means, you ate it, means you're eating it, you're using it, you're enjoying it, you're gleaning from it, you're gaining from it. According to Rashi, therefore, the Rebbe says, the Lubavitcher Rebbe explained, Joseph's advice to Pharaoh came from another detail. Which detail? that the fat cows and the lean cows were standing right near each other, right here at the edge of the bank. You had these sets of cows together. How can they both be together? Only, as we explained, if during the years of plenty, you are actively focused on preparing for the years of famine. The years of famine are in your mind, in your heart, and in your behavior during the years of plenty. Both sets of cows coexist. One more detail to emphasize before we get to the psychological and spiritual dimension. The Ramban emphasizes that there are some differences between the way Pharaoh has the dream in the Torah's record and the way he gives over the dream to Joseph. And the Ramban says that we don't have to be worried about these differences because Pharaoh's told Joseph everything that he saw. It's just the Torah doesn't repeat everything. Others, I should say, have a different interpretation, a different perspective, but this is the Ramban's perspective. It's so important to emphasize this because the detail of the two sets of cows standing near each other simultaneously, Pharaoh, we don't have recorded in the Torah that Pharaoh told that to Joseph. It does say it in the original dream, that Pharaoh dreamed that the two sets of cows were there with each other. But it does not say it when Pharaoh repeats to Joseph the dream. According to the above, this would be problematic because this was Joseph's genius. It was this detail that Joseph accounted for. But again, the Ramban says that whatever happened, Pharaoh repeated it. It's just the Torah doesn't concern itself with repeating every detail. Perhaps we can add an idea that Pharaoh was listening to what the experts were saying. They were all trying to account for this detail, which he told them because they had to account for it. But none of their accounts were satisfactory because they didn't work. The two sets of cows coexisting simply did not work in the different interpretations. And it may be that the fact that the Torah eliminates these words is perhaps Pharaoh has given up on the possibility that Joseph from all would be able to interpret this coexistence. But as we said, according to the Ramban, Pharaoh did say it to Joseph. He said everything to Joseph. It's just the Torah doesn't repeat every detail. Now, every narrative, every story in Torah can be understood on a physical, concrete dimension and also psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. Every person has two phases in their life, or I should say most of us have two phases in our lives. We have times of plenty and we have times of famine. We have times of plenty when we are fulfilled, when we are wholesome, when we're happy, when things are going well externally and internally. But unfortunately, life also brings with it times of famine, times of pain, times of challenge, times of difficulty, times of agony, and times of starvation on different levels. It may be, of course, financially, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. The challenge of so many of us is that these two phases in life are completely separate. They're detached from each other. And when we are in our years of plenty, when we're healthy, when we're successful, when things are going well and fine, we ignore the possibility of famine in life. We behave as though we are invincible. We may not necessarily dedicate time to develop a true, deep relationship with our spouses, for example, with good friends, for example, with our soul, with our truth, with our integrity, with God, because we really don't need anybody. You know, when you're very successful, you really don't need anybody. You're flying high. The world needs you. Or you think the world needs you, and you're just oblivious. You know the story about the fishermen. There was a group of fishermen who went out on a boat to fish on a nice day. Suddenly, from nowhere, a major storm erupted and was threatening to capsize, to turn over their boat, and they realized that momentarily they may end up in the waters and that may be the end. So one of the fishermen turns to his friend and says, you know, you better start praying now. Pray to God to save us. We need God. And the man says, listen, I haven't prayed to God in years and years. I don't even know what it means to pray. Well, he says, I couldn't care less. You just figure out how to pray and start praying. So the man turns to heaven and says, my dear God, listen, I have not bothered you now for 15 years. I'm making a deal with you. If you just do what I need right now and you get me back to my home, I promise you I will not bother you for the next 15 years. During the times of plenty, everything is perfect. You don't need anybody. You need a real relationship. You need to be honest. You need to be vulnerable. Tell me, you need one real friend in your life. What do you need for? Everything is great. Problem is that famine might come. We hope it doesn't, but famine might come. And then you do need a real friend. And then you do need a real relationship. And then you do have to know your soul. And then you do need a relationship with God. And then you have to be real. And then you need to find the purity in you, the idealism in you, which doesn't change throughout the different experiences of life. You have to find that part of you that cannot be destroyed during times of famine. But the problem is, if you didn't cultivate it during the years of plenty, you may not be able to discover it suddenly in the years of famine. It's like with friends. If you don't spend energy to cultivate a real relationship with a friend, then when you might need a friend, it's not going to be easy to get one. During the good days, you have to have a real relationship. So when a bad day comes, God forbid, you'll have what to connect to. And this is Joseph's wisdom that so impressed Pharaoh, not just on an economic level, but even more on a psychological and a spiritual level. Because in human nature, we become intoxicated. During the times of plenty, I become drunk. And thus, during the years of famine, I can become despaired and depressed. And Joseph's genius and Joseph's depth and Joseph's guidance was, you must connect the 2 years. The 2 years must coexist. The 7 set of fat cows and healthy, robust cows must be standing near the 7 lean cows. Not to say that you must have a pessimistic outlook that any day there won't be food on your table. But what Joseph is saying is something much deeper and something more rich. Don't become self-absorbed and narcissistic in life and so oblivious to life. During your good times, cultivate those priorities, those ideals, those qualities that will be timeless, that will be eternal, that whatever happens in the world, you remain connected to. They cannot leave you. So that if 7 years of famine come, you have right there everything you put away during the 7 years of plenty. It's been said one of the reasons why during a marriage under the chuppah, the groom breaks a glass. He screams, Mazel Tov. And the reason he breaks the glass is what's known as Zeichel Churban. We remember during times of joy, we remember the destruction. We remember the broken hearts. We remember that there's so much pain in the world. We remember Jerusalem and the Holy Temple that was destroyed and still not rebuilt. The question is, why right then? Why then at the end of the chuppah when the festivities are about to break out and the champagne bottles are about to be popped and the dancing is about to break out in its full joy and celebration, why right then? A moment before do we have to break the glass? And one of the answers that's been given is that people who in the height of their joy can remember the pain that still exists in the world and be sensitive to the tears that still flow in our world. When they might experience a moment of pain, they will be able to remember all the joy that exists in the world. But people who in the height of their own joy become indifferent and oblivious to the brokenness that exists in the world, then when they experience a moment of brokenness, that becomes their only reality. And they have no inspiration, joy to draw from. So when you're on top of the world, you have to make sure that there's some people you're really close to. There's some people you have a very real relationship with. There's people you could be completely naked and vulnerable with. Because today you may not need it. Today you may not think you need it. But one day that is what might sustain you. Your true friendships, your honesty, your true relationships, your real integrity, your depth. This is what Joseph taught us. It's what he taught Pharaoh, and it's what he continues to teach us. Make sure that in your life there's no fragmentation between good days and difficult days. It's one life. Link them as one. Good night.